It's taken us longer than we would have liked to get to this next story because other news kept getting in the way, but we think it's still worth examining because of what it says about intelligence matters and the way that journalists report them. It's the story of that Hollywood movie, The Interview, North Korea, and the hacking of Sony Pictures, which made news and a fair amount of gossip all around the world. By now, you probably know the plot has a couple of American journalists recruited by the CIA to kill North Korea's supreme leader, Kim Jong-un. Just days before the film was to premiere in cinemas, Sony Pictures pulled it, fearing, quote, 9/11-style attacks, unquote, on theaters that showed it. The threat came from a group of hackers that had already caused havoc with a cyber attack on Sony Pictures and leaked reams of the studio's confidential information. Washington was quick to blame the hack on North Korea, and many in the U.S. news media could not wait to do the same. The New York Times and the Washington Post were among the news outlets that once again quoted anonymous intelligence officials pointing the finger, despite consistent denials from North Korea, as well as a chorus of cyber experts who were beyond dubious. Pyongyang's official response to the film, that releasing it would amount to an act of war, also struck people as a reach. But when you consider the way that the country's been depicted by Hollywood, and then take a closer look at what was actually revealed in the hack job on Sony Pictures, you may reconsider. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on how a screwball comedy turned into a serious story that failed to get the coverage that its seriousness deserved.
Please tell me you know that that's a stupid idea.
Forget for a moment that this story started with a movie. Set aside, for now, the cyber theft angle, that Sony had its communications stolen by hackers unknown. And park the whole freedom of expression argument. It can be a distraction. The real story is about intelligence and how the Western media tends to report on it.
The feds have determined who is to blame.
The president acknowledging North Korea is behind it,
regardless of whether the story is in the Far East or the Middle East.
The media immediately accepted the narrative, the FBI narrative, that North Korea was responsible for the hacking. We've seen this kind of script before. We've seen the United States government present an intelligence profile of a country and then expect the world to fall into lockstep with that account. In 2003, then Secretary of State Colin Powell presented what he claimed was an airtight case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction before the UN Security Council.
I believe this conclusion is irrefutable and undeniable.
The same thing happened in the Vietnam War with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the NSA essentially told the military and the civilian leadership that the North Vietnamese had attacked the United States, when in fact they had not.
We believe at least 2 of the attacking boats were sunk.
And so I think it's important for the media to be very careful and scrutinize government claims like this very carefully.
We can confirm that North Korea engaged in this attack.
Or we could end up in a situation like these past situations where we react too quickly and realize that we have attacked an actor that may not have been involved.
Pyongyang has repeatedly denied that it was behind the hack on Sony, which in and of itself is not enough to throw off even the most gullible journalist. But then there are the numerous cyber experts who have picked apart the evidence against North Korea. And if that's not cause for a bit of skepticism, then take a look at the initial demands of the Guardians of Peace, the group that claimed responsibility for the hack.
The Guardians of Peace never even mentioned the interview for 3 weeks, and only the first instance in which they mentioned the film was to say that the interview had nothing to do with why they hacked into Sony.
The hackers initially were trying to extort money from Sony. They had nothing to say at all about North Korea or the interview until the media brought it up more than a week later. Once a reporter was asking questions as to whether this hack was connected to the interview, then the hackers started making demands that the studio pull the movie from theaters and not distribute it online.
And so the movie itself has become a central theme. You know, who's to tell us that we can't create a movie with a plot line like this? Who's to tell us where and when we can show this kind of a movie? That being said, I think it's really important to keep in mind that as sacrosanct and as legitimate as the right to free expression is, you also have a responsibility to at least consider the implications of your speech.
Seth Rogen, the interview's director and co-star, claims that the film was not meant to be controversial. However, read the hacked Sony emails. They will tell you a different story. The hack revealed that Sony had enlisted the services of Bruce Bennett, a senior defense analyst at the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation was set up after World War II when the Pentagon decided that it needed a private organization to link military planning with research and development decisions. Ever since, RAND has played a key role in formulating a number of US policies. In an exchange in June last year with Sony's CEO, Michael Linton, Bennett opposed toning down the film's controversial ending, saying, "I have been clear that an assassination of Kim Jong-un is the most likely path to a collapse of the North Korean government," adding that the film will start some real thinking. In response, Linton wrote, "Bruce spoke to someone very senior in the state, confidentially. He agreed with everything you have been saying. Everything."
The RAND Corporation has very close ties to U.S. officials. And I think it's the whole point of why there was this interaction and contact between U.S. government officials and the RAND Corporation and Sony, and that all parties review this movie as not mere entertainment, but as having the potential of inspiring regime change.
Bruce Bennett, his major thesis has been, for the past few years, that the way to make the North Korean government collapse is to take out its leadership. So in other words, a plot line that is eerily similar to that which we see in the interview.
If that email is in fact true, it tells me that the producers of the film and executives at Sony Corporation understood, at least to some extent, that the plot line was provocative, would be provocative to North Korea, and in particular the regime there.
And one thing that I would also mention is the fact that Michael Linton, who's the CEO of Sony Entertainment, is actually on the board of trustees of RAND Corporation. So you see this very intimate relationship between Sony and the military-industrial complex.
Coming back to the freedom of expression argument, it boils down to two very different perspectives. Despite the threat of violence, US theaters were reportedly packed with moviegoers who were off to see a film described by its director as very silly because they said it was their patriotic duty. In North Korea, the state broadcaster was calling the interview an act of terrorism.
For the general population, the leadership in North Korea is deified. They're like a god. And to have, imagine if you will, a film where the Prophet Muhammad or a film where Jesus Christ was considered a target for assassination, you would offend an awful lot of people. And so that kind of cognitive dissonance within North Korea would not be helpful, would certainly be destabilizing.
Look, I think any time that somebody feels threatened enough to not speak, then that is a freedom of expression issue. You know, in the United States, we call it the heckler's veto, that something isn't spoken because of its content, but because we're afraid of the reaction. And that should never be the case.
Without the controversy attached, the biggest reaction to the interview would have come from film critics, and they probably wouldn't have been kind. But a combination of circumstances, flawed reporting and misplaced patriotism turned the film into a geopolitical football, a must-watch for many Americans, and an unlikely hit online. If we could ask the hackers one question, it would be, who's laughing now? But, as usual, they were unavailable for comment.
More voices on the download now on the way the interview story was covered.
North Korea's position in the international community is what allows a film like this to be made in the first place. You would never see a film like this about China or Japan. And that's partly because North Korea doesn't have the international lobbying or the US domestic lobbying power to push back against something like this.
Coverage on this story was really getting in the way of a lot of real news that was occurring in North Korea at the time, and I think it was a shame really that the interview was really the leading world story for such a long time. It really obscured a lot of other news stories on North Korea.